February 4th meeting of the North St. Paul Planning Commission. Did you want to take the roll, please, Eric?
Yes. Chair Barton.
Here.
Commissioner Blees.
Here. Yeah, I was muted. I'm here.
Commissioner Brenna.
Here.
Commissioner Gleebman.
Geldman.
Geldman. Okay.
Yes, I'm here.
I do not see Commissioner Mongi on.
I don't either.
Commissioner Wise.
Here.
And Commissioner Worm.
All righty, we have a quorum then. On to the adoption of the agenda. Oh, so this, now we could just page through this. Isn't this nice? So I'll entertain a motion to adopt the agenda.
So moved. This is Rick.
Moved by Rick, and I heard Al's voice. Al, do you want to second that?
Second by Al.
Okie dokie. All those in favor say aye. Oh, you want to do the roll then?
I'll do the roll, yes. I'll go out of order just to make it interesting. Commissioner, please.
Here. Yes. Aye. Sorry.
Right. Commissioner Brenna. Commissioner Brenna.
Aye.
Commissioner Gleebman. Geldman, sorry.
Yes.
Aye. Commissioner Wise.
Aye.
Commissioner Worm.
Aye.
And Chair Barton.
Aye. Righty, we've got the agenda. Then the next item is approval of the December 3rd meeting minutes. Anybody have any additions or corrections? If not, I'll entertain a motion to approve the minutes, the draft minutes as presented.
I so move.
Al moves approval. Do I have a second?
I'll second. Patrick.
Patrick seconds. So all those in favor will say aye. Opposed will say nay when Eric calls the roll.
Wonderful. Commissioner Brenna.
Aye.
Commissioner Geldman.
Aye.
Commissioner Wise.
Aye.
Commissioner Worm.
Aye.
Chair Barton.
Aye. Ready, those are approved. And we're on to meeting open to the public. Eric, I don't believe I saw any members of the public. Let me just look at.
I'm going to check again, but yeah, the only person is the North St. Paul control room, so no.
Okay, then we'll move, we don't have any public hearings, so we'll go down to the big item on the agenda, which is our review of the prior discussions, I guess, for the zoning update. So I'll turn it over to Eric, our planner, to run through this.
Okay, thank you. I'm getting to the page. This is obviously this is a very large document, and just to reiterate, we are not asking for any formal action tonight, but we are hoping to have quite a bit of discussion, particularly for the new members. This is to introduce all the items that have been discussed, but Chair Barton and myself, we talked this afternoon. We're trying to take this opportunity to also do a little zoning code education at the same time. So following this meeting, if you come up with any other additional ideas of changes or issues, you can email me and I'll include it in our next packet. But the idea is that today we'll discuss the amendments. We will then put this on the March agenda, provided that they're isn't a large amount of changes, the expectation would be a public hearing in April. That being said, April isn't really, a final date if we have other items to discuss. So don't feel burdened that we need to set that timeline. But the Met Council does require that the zoning ordinance be updated to be compliant with the comprehensive plan. The Met Council understands with COVID and Zoom and everything, things are taking a little longer, but we just want to make sure we have a spread. We will talk about the sign ordinance that is in your packet. There are quite a few updates that need to be done to the sign ordinance to be compliant with more state statute and even U.S. Supreme Court rulings. But the sign ordinance isn't really an element of the comprehensive plan. So we'll discuss it here, but I think we will actually peel that off and tackle that a little bit more in depth and adopt that at a separate time. I think when we get to the point of discussing these, you'll see why we think that one needs to be peeled off a little bit more. So on your screen is all the items that were discussed previously by the Planning Commission. And again, we want to be able to have the opportunity for everybody to review and understand these, but as you've seen through the packet, we're not going to go through it page by page. So we'll go through it, section by section, and when questions come up, we'll discuss them, but we won't go through them page by page. But for maybe a little background on why this is so important, even beyond the Met Council, I put a couple slides together to just give an example that may indicate why this is so important. Can everybody see the presentation now on your screen? Okay.
Yes.
Yep.
Thank you. So we're going to use the example of talking about a front yard setback. So, if somebody asks what a front yard setback is and what can you do in it, there's a lot of sections of the code that relate to this. First, is going to be talking about definitions. So when you talk about something like a front yard setback, there's actually multiple definitions you need to look at. And when we amend a single definition, that may have an unintended consequence if we don't look at the other definitions and how they interrelate. So, if we're talking about a front yard setback and what a resident could do in their front yard, first we have to look at the definition of yard, which the definition of the yard is here, but I highlighted some areas I really want to hit. It's an unoccupied or unobstructed by structure from the lowest level to the sky. So it's not just what's happening on the ground, the grass of your yard. It's actually happening from there all the way to the sky. So that's just the yard. That doesn't describe the front or the setback. So it goes on to talk about the front yard. So separate from the yard, there's the front yard, which is the portion of the yard from the front lot line to the depth required by the setback. And for this example, we don't even really care what the depth is because all the definitions talk about how all front yards work. So then what is the front lot line? We have a definition of a front lot line. And what's interesting here is in the case of a corner lot, it is the shortest dimension of a public space. If you think about a lot of commercial buildings, longer than it is wide. But this says the front is actually that shorter distance. So that's what the definition says. Only when it's a corner lot of equal dimension, can the owner choose? So then we talk about what's a setback, what's from the lot line to the depth. So it's the distance between the building and the property line. And then it goes on to talk about what is the building. The building is any structure or shelter, human sport, or enclosure for a person, animal, or property. So essentially the heated enclosed space, but it's that part of the building. And then the building frontage, the facade of the building most nearly parallel to the public right of way. So if you changed any one part of the definition, that could or could not have an impact on the other definitions, but it definitely has an impact on how you define a front yard. Such as if we change where it says front lot line front, if we change that instead of to be the shortest dimension of the public streets, you change that to be the frontage adjacent to the front or main entrance, that could change where the front yard is just by tweaking a small part of the definition. So this is one part of it. I got 2 more slides, but I just wanted to indicate there's a lot of definitions that go into making one determination, such as a front yard is from the ground to the sky, from the front lot line to the depth of the required setback, et cetera, et cetera. But if you change any one piece, that could have a huge impact on what is a front yard. But this says unoccupied or unobstructed. And as we all know, you may not want a building in your front yard, but there may be other things that would obstruct. So there is a section of the code, 154.010A5, which talks about non-encroachments. These are things that are not counted as encroachments. So these would not count as obstructions. So they're basically like exceptions, things that can be in a yard. So there's canopies, cornices, chimneys, flues, etc. But they can only extend 2 feet in. But that makes sense because, if you got an eave on a roof, you don't want that eave to be right at the property line or at the setback line. You want that eave to be able to extend out into the yard. Here it says it could be up to 2 feet. Then what other things could be in this area? Because we talked about that occupied space is part of the building. Well, if you have a bay window that is no more than 20 square feet, that can extend up to 4.5 feet into a front or rear yard, or 2 feet of the side yard. So you can have the eave, you can have a bay window. Well, talking about the ground, if you have your landing place or an uncovered porch, that could extend into your front or rear yard 6 feet. So you got your front stoop, you got an uncovered porch, that can be in part of your front yard. So to continue, then you have decks, terraces, and stoops. They can extend up to 6 feet, pretty much the same as the porch. But it's provided that the elevation above the height of the ground, which does not extend in elevation above the height of the ground level. So the deck, in this case, wouldn't count as a deck off of the second story. This would only be a deck off of the main floor. Walls, fences, and hedges, obviously those are things that would be in a yard. So they say that that's allowed, provided they don't obstruct the view for traffic. And then finally, you get into those balconies and breezeways. They're only allowed in rear yards. Now, I think for many people, if you think of a single family house, many of these things would make sense. Now, think of the new building going in downtown. you would think that the upper stories would have a balcony. According to this, they can't extend past the setback line. So all these come into play if we have a whole set of different definitions that call or describe what is a front yard, but then we have these exceptions to talk about what can extend into the front yard. And in this case, a balcony cannot extend into a front yard. That's just an example to walk through to kind of see how it's important for us to look at these details as we do this text amendment, that if you tweak one element, you might end up getting some unintended consequences, but also try to give you a kind of a real life example of how we'd implement this. Chair Barton, do you have anything you'd like to add before we move on to reviewing any sections?
No, I think that was a nice example. And I think particularly as it applies to balconies, and we have, you know, the multifamily housing that's being built, multi-story, and balconies are certainly something that nowadays in particular is really popular. The one comment I will make, if you go to a prior slide, and that had to do with the front yard. One of the unintended consequences of a prior update was the front yard definition is extending from the right-of-way line, or the lot line, I guess is an easier way to put it, to the depth required in the setback regulation. Well, at one time, our setback was 30 feet in residential districts, in the R1, which is the single-family residential district, and we reduced that to 25. So there became an issue that there was this 5 feet of yard that really, from the definitional perspective, was not part of the front yard. Mm-hmm. And so that's one of those things that we need to fix, because obviously it is. The front yard is really extends from the lot line to the nearest portion of the principal building, is really the way it's normally written. And that's the way the rear yard, interestingly, is defined, from the building to the rear lot line. So that's just an example of how little things, if sometimes it's easy for us to forget or to question, well, do we define this term? Because if we define it and we're changing a piece of the code that references it, we want to make sure that these things are going to sync up and not going to cause some issue that didn't occur to us. So hopefully that's not too confusing, but it's just an example of how, especially when we're writing code or recommending, code to the council, there's a lot of detail. There's a lot of, what do you want to call it? We have a lot of discretion in what we think would be good to have in the code, but there's also a lot of detail because of that reason. So that's all I would add. So I appreciate that you did this, Eric.
Mm-hmm.
Eric, I got a question for you. How do you determine where your front lot line is, especially in older homes?
Well, here the front lot line would be the right-of-way line to the depth of the front setback. So if an older home is closer than what the code setback is, then we start getting into one of those interesting things of nonconformities. But here, as it's written, it's the setback measurement in the code for the front, as Chair Barton said, not the building.
And the lot line is just essentially your property line.
Yep.
I always thought it was better to take the center of the road to the frontage.
Well, there are codes that do that. In communities where all the roads are local and all the roads are pretty much the same width, that works pretty well. When you start having county roads or arterials or collectors that get wider, then it gets more difficult to use the center line. But as Chair Barton said, you have discretion to pick where the measurement comes from. It's just once it's adopted, it's always going to be that measurement. But right now we have the ability to review these items, determine what is the best place to measure from. But with the the arterial and collector roads that exist in the city, I think it's difficult to adopt a standard that's center line and kind of have that appear equally across the community. Any other questions? If not, I'll go back to the other screen and I'll move on to the going through section by section. Again, we're not asking for people to have completely absorbed all the elements in each one of these sections. Tonight's a discussion, and then next month we really want to get into, are the proposed revisions correct, or are there elements we want to look at further? So I started by just providing a schedule of the previous meetings, working backwards basically from December back to last February. And that's kind of the order of the sections as I brought them through. You can see many of these items were looked at a number of times. So, they've been completed in that they looked at a number of changes and possibilities, took feedback from the Planning Commission, made revisions based on that. You'll see the sign ordinance wasn't introduced till December. And then when we get to the sign ordinance, we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail, but I would recommend we peel that off and concentrate on the other sections and address the sign ordinance in more detail, but we'll get to that section. So this was the first section. Well, this wasn't even the section. This was the meeting in February. So this was before the amendments actually began, but it was the discussion of the comprehensive plan had just been adopted in January. Typically you have 9 months to update your code, discussion with the Planning Commission of what elements needed to be reviewed, and some of the big topics that are expected to be added. So this is how that list of items came to be initiated by staff based on the elements that were created in the comprehensive plan, but reviewed and acknowledged by the Planning Commission before we actually started working on some of these elements. So the first element is actually, we're talking about the text in most detail. The last example we gave was about the text, but the comprehensive plan adopted a land use map, and the zoning of properties should comply with that land use map. So the areas that are bordered by black are all parcels that do not conform with the land use map, and those would be proposed to be changed along with the changes to the zoning ordinance. So with there, I'll pause, see if anybody think of any particular property where they think that the zoning might be out of place from the land use, but this indicates the parcels that would need to change.
Can I ask you, I see you had some random bolded parcels, the little individual ones, but it looks like you got whole blocks that are non-conforming. What might be causing that?
A lot of times it's lot size and use, but you can see in many cases they are real close to downtown. It's identifying trying to identify a proper transition. Might even be allowing more flexibility in use than what would typically be expected in a residential neighborhood. Does that help?
I still see you left.
It does, yeah. Thank you. Sorry, Al.
Eric, I see you left the 60-foot wide lots, and for R1 is 60. I request to have that changed to 40. Is that a possibility?
It is a possibility. I'll ask you to please give me till next month to look into it a little bit more due to my newness to the community. But maybe I'll ask you to expand on this. This is existing lots that are 40 feet wide that you want to adjust the zoning, or there's areas of town that might have wider lots that you want to be able to be subdivided down to 40 feet?
Well, mainly because there's a lot of 40-foot older homes. Plus, we were requested to. The citizen had a 100-foot lot. He wanted to put it to 50 feet each. We won't let him do it because we got that 60-foot lot line limit.
So it's really about existing, what you would call oversized lots being able to split. And I think, we had talked about potentially both the 40 and 50 as being the minimum. And I think, if I recall, the consensus was more around 50 because there were a number of 100-foot lots.
Yeah, I would confirm that as well. That's what I recall.
And the question that occurred to me after the fact, and if you look around, particularly around Silver Lake, and you look at the kind of outlined area around the properties there you go. That's the Shoreland Overlay District. And the question that occurred to me after we had that discussion was, that's an area that we don't want an excess amount of impervious surface. So when you talk about, adding more lots, you're obviously talking more homes and that kind of thing. So that was one of the things I had mentioned to Eric, maybe take a look at that, because our lot size of 60 feet right now is already below what's MnDOT or the DNR recommends for a shoreland overlay. So that was just one of those little wrinkles that occurred to me. I think it was because we had some kind of request, and it just struck me that that might be something we want to rethink for shoreland overlay. So I passed that on to Eric just as an FYI.
Yeah.
You could make that lot width, for instance, a shoreland overlay unique component.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. I'm just, again, it's one of those options that we hadn't discussed before. So I thought I'll pass it on, since we're going to be, we're getting hopefully to the point where we'll actually be making a recommendation on all these changes in the next couple months. So now's the time to try to discover any of those little wrinkles that we might want to get addressed.
So to just build on that a little bit, but Chair Barton's correct. We will it's kind of like a new section we'll look at that we haven't looked at before. I'll try to limit it kind of to the lot width or lot area, but to the point that Commissioner Blees was making, you could see on this map, and this is how overlay districts work. We have two overlay districts. We have shoreland overlay and we have the downtown district overlay. So shoreland around Silver Lake, shoreland up here in the northwest corner. You'll note some of these other smaller areas, which may be just smaller, are not in the shoreland overlay. And then downtown isn't even currently all of kind of what most people would think of downtown. There are two sections. But when you have a base zoning and you have an overlay district, the regulations are the more restrictive of the two districts. So if we increase the lot size in the base zone, then everything that is R1 would have to apply across the city. If we create a wider width for lots in the shoreland overlay, then that would only apply in these two areas of the two shoreland overlays. So that's the way overlay districts work. There's two sets of regulations. What applies is the more restrictive of the two, but we'll get into more detail at the next meeting. I'm sorry, did I hear a question? Okay. Any other questions about the proposed zoning changes?
Eric, perhaps there is a question. Now, the shoreland overlay, I guess that is part of the comprehensive plan, but it isn't in the planned land use map, I don't believe. So
correct. Well, yeah, that could be. It could be that we mention it more in parks and open space or surface water management. There's other chapters in the comp plan.
Mm-hmm. Okay, is that then
correct?
Is that then part of the Metro Council requirement that we have our zoning map correspond to the comprehensive plan?
So the Met Council is not the only agency that regulates. So is
DNR.
So the DNR. So we would need, the zoning needs to meet both the Metropolitan Council regulations and the DNR regulations.
Okay, good enough. Thank you.
Sorry, Eric, one more question about just specifically about the subdivision issue. You're saying the more restrictive rule would be the factor that we would have to go by, or the owner would have to go by. In the case of subdividing, is it looked at more restrictive to require larger lots, or is it more restrictive?
In your base zoning ordinance, you have lot area and you have lot width. Now, typically the pattern falls that the smaller the minimum lot area, the smaller the width. But they are independent. And when I bring forward the shoreland ordinance at the next meeting, I'll show you how they address both. But it isn't necessary to increase the minimum lot area in order to increase the width. But I think it's a good discussion to have and see what makes sense.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions about the zoning map? If not, I'll go on to the next section. Oops. So this is related to our previous discussion of lot sizes and areas. So with the comprehensive plan, with the adjustments in density both basically to medium density and high density in downtown. It was the R2, the mixed use 1, mixed use 2, and mixed use 3 that needed to be looked at. And so in the R2, the area was reduced to comply with the density. That's the cross outs in blue. And then similarly in the mixed use districts, the minimum lot area per unit. So it isn't a set lot size for the whole parcel. It's how many units are on that parcel is the size. So it usually works out the opposite, essentially that the smaller parcel you have, the less units you get. But in the typical high density zone, instead of having one standard for the entire lot, the lot size is based on the number of units, which is how we implement density.
Eric,
Yes.
on that page that you're just on, under MU1, the minimum lot size is 0, and that just doesn't sit well with me. It seems like if you got a 20-foot width requirement, there ought to be some area involved in the minimum lot size. It almost seems like there's also a minimum lot area per dwelling unit. So if you divide the 1980 by 20 foot,
Yep.
Wouldn't that be, I don't know, maybe that is a.
I'm kind of guessing here, but downtown being older is pretty unique. There's quite a few lots that not only are thin, but some might be less than 20 feet. There's quite a few that are not the full depth of kind of to the alley. So there are some very small lots.
Yeah.
And if there isn't any lots that are 0, but there are some lots that are 1,000 square feet or less.
Yeah. I just.
If we pick a number.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, if we pick a number that's larger than any of those lots, then those lots become non-conforming, and we just need to be aware that could create an issue.
Yeah, I don't know that it's a lot if it's 0 area.
Right, correct.
Maybe 1 square foot would be,
Yeah, but sorry.
This is an aside, but it's kind of funny. When I was a kid, I owned a part of Antarctica, or at least had a 20-year lease on it, and it was 20 square feet. So, but never got to see it. But it seems like even just putting it at 1 square foot or something like that might be worthwhile. Just something to note.
Nope, I can understand that. Anyone else? Okay. So the next set of regulations we looked at was the table of uses. So we talked about the yard in the beginning and definitions and how we use those. Every use has a definition as well, but not every use should be allowed in every district. Particularly, when we're talking about R1, 2, and 3, the R stands for residential. So you wouldn't expect commercial businesses in them, but in residential districts, you do expect, institutional or civic uses. So there is a list, and then there's other uses that may be occurring at the same time in a house, like a daycare or something like that. So that's just why we look at the table of uses as well as implementing some of the comprehensive plan. So I'm going to try to zoom this up. But the ones in bold were the ones that were proposed to change. So 2-family dwellings were added both to R1 and R3. Oh, and maybe particularly for the people who are new to the Planning Commission, the letters are P for permitted, C for conditional, and then I for interim. Now, interim uses could be typically one of two things. Things that come and go over time. You'll see, say under civic and institutional uses, community gardens, that's an I. You know, you may have a garden for 1 year, or even a number of years, but it may go away. Other I's may be uses that don't comply with the comprehensive plan, meaning it's not something the community sees a long-term history of, but you don't want to make it non-conforming. So it's an interim use, meaning, you know, for example, in many communities, that might be a gravel mine. You know, that happens, but when it's over, it's going to convert to some other use. Sometimes it may be, you know, more heavy industrial that wants to go away over time. But so that's the I. But 2-family was added to R1 and R3. Townhomes were added to R3, and then mixed use 1 and 2. I'm not going to go through all of them, but just point out a couple. Parks were added to the mixed use. Oops, sorry. Here, parking facilities were added to the mixed use 3. Oh, maybe one other thing I would point out is this far right column, supplemental regulations. If there's an X, that means there's a section of the code that has specific standards that use. So it may have limitations on square footage, it may have limitations on hours, it could be other things, but it's just indicating you can't just look at the standards in the code. There's another section you need to review to make sure those comply.
Before we go from that page.
Yep.
If you could, as I was looking through these, I wondered why funeral home is permitted in the R3 and is conditional in all the mixed use.
That is a very good question. You know, I could see that maybe there is an existing funeral home in the R3, or maybe even it's appropriate in the R3, but you would think that would be conditional as well.
Well, I couldn't think of one in the R3. Can anybody else? The R3 is like a residential multifamily.
Right.
I couldn't figure that one out.
Well, I'm going to do one thing before we decide what to do with it.
Yeah.
I'll look up the funeral homes in North St. Paul just to ensure that they're
Absolutely.
that none of them are in R3. But
yeah,
I agree with you that does seem odd. But even if there is an existing funeral home, a conditional use would make more sense.
Eric, just a quick question. What does conditional use mean exactly?
So the first step is if it's a permitted use, somebody can come into City Hall and basically go straight to building permit. They don't have to come to the Planning Commission or City Council to get a permit before they apply for a building permit. If it's a conditional use, then a public hearing is required by the Planning Commission and adoption by the City Council. And if I can go one step further, even though I think city attorney may provide some training here in the near future, if it's a conditional use, you can't deny it because you don't like the use. If it's a conditional use in that zoning district, that use gets to happen. But the conditional use means you get to place conditions on it. So you may limit its size, you may limit its height, you may limit its hours of operation, but you can't just deny it if it's listed here as a conditional use. And so what happens a lot of times is the conditions may make it economically infeasible to operate or unattractive, but you can't deny it.
Could I just mention something? When you said somebody could go, if it's a permitted use, they can go straight to building permit, but that's so long as they meet all of the standards for that particular use in that particular zoning district.
Yeah.
So that's what the code then identifies as all of the various standards that need to be met. And the same is true for a conditional use. It would still need to meet the underlying standards in the zoning district, but the planning commission can recommend additional conditions on top of that, because conditional use is kind of one that may create problems. It's that kind of use where there's the possibility that it wouldn't be ideal. And that's the reason it's conditional as far as compatibility with nearby uses.
Well, and it also could be location specific.
Yes.
And that,
Yeah.
a commercial zone surrounded by commercial zones, it may be a perfectly fine use.
Right.
But if it's a commercial zone next to residential, you may want additional screening or additional setback, or onto a major road, you may want to limit access, things like that.
Yeah.
But yes, it's something that needs to be looked at a little further and may need conditions that are beyond the code. So, to expand on what Chair Barton said, if you have a permitted use, but you can't meet all the standards, you may have to request a variance. Well, variance comes to the planning commission, holds a public hearing, provides a recommendation to the council, and then the council may ultimately grant the variance. So if it can't meet the code, you will see it. But if it can meet all the standards within the ordinance, then it goes on just to building permit. Good clarification. So the next page, it doesn't look like there are any changes. The one thing I'd point out here is home occupation, which is kind of a catch-all. There's a lot of different types of home occupation. So this is listed as P/I, and you see the X by supplemental regulations. We'd need to know a little bit more to know if they need an interim use permit or if it's just permit.
Before you go away from that one, could I just ask another question? Again, we've looked at this detailed list for a long time, but down in the second bundle or the last bundle where it has the daycare facility, 2 daycare facilities, one for 12 or fewer and the next one for 13 through 16. Those are permitted just straight across the board. So I'm just wondering why we have 2 categories.
Well, you're probably correct that we don't need that on this table. It's more on the licensing side.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
A daycare under 12 persons doesn't need to be permitted through the state where, and state statute, the city can't prevent them. But to your point, it doesn't have to be 2 lines. It's permitted across the board.
I
We
mean,
can
that's
handle that
cool.
in different sections of the code or whatever.
I
But
just didn't know if we had changed one of them, and maybe it was a conditional use somewhere, but apparently,
could have been. So what this is saying is you're being more permissive than what the state would require.
right.
The state would not allow you to make a daycare facility with 12 or fewer as a conditional use. State statute exempts those and says they're permitted by right. So it could be that there was a choice to make North St. Paul more permissive.
Yeah.
But that being said, there's no reason why we have to have two lines on the chart to do that.
And below that, it has surface parking, which, again, I don't have a problem with surface parking, although apparently we don't allow it in any of the mixed-use districts. Surface parking isn't defined anywhere in the zoning code, so.
Well, that's a good point. We should look at surface parking to see if we need a definition. But what that could be, but wouldn't seem weird, particularly that it's not in the MU1. We don't list accessory uses here. So often there's an accessory use.
Mhm.
And that is, there needs to be another use first. So it can't be only that use.
Right.
So I'm not sure if that was the intent. So if you had like surface parking and it was blank, maybe that surface parking is permitted as an accessory use with a building, but they didn't want lots that were only parking.
Right, but certainly we have surface parking in the MU2 and MU3.
Right.
So that's what I looked at and thought, I don't understand what that is trying to do. So I just thought I'd bring it up since.
No, that's good. Does seem odd. Okay, so I'll go back just to give one last opportunity to talk about uses. And while you're thinking, so we kind of break the zoning code in general into two parts: uses, what use is allowed or not, and then what we often refer to as bulk standards, which are the setbacks, the lot sizes, the impervious surfaces. So it's almost like looking at, for the bulk standards, you're permitting a building. You're not really permitting what use is in that building, because any permitted use could go in that building. But the bulk standard talks about how big the building can be, where it can be located on the property, how tall that building could be. So here we're talking about uses, and just give one last opportunity for anybody with any questions about uses. Okay.
And you
Hearing
should,
none?
you
Oh,
might
sorry.
want to mention as well that if somebody wants to use a property for a particular reason and it's not already listed as a use on one of these tables, then that would require a text amendment to add that particular use. We did that not long ago with the tattoo shop,
Right.
because tattoos shops were not permitted in the, I think it was the MU1 if I'm not mistaken. And so that was a step that needed to be taken. And that also would first come to the Planning Commission, who would look at it and then determine if any additional bulk standards, as you called them, should be applied as well. And then that goes on to the council.
That's a very good point, because kind of for two reasons. The state statute looks at uses and bulk standards differently, in that the code has to say what's allowed as a use, and if it's not listed, it's assumed it's not allowed. It has to be listed to be allowed. Bulk standards, they look at it kind of the other way. If you don't have a height restriction, there is no height restriction. You can go as high as you want. If you didn't have a height restriction, that doesn't mean it's zero. It actually means it's unlimited. So if you don't list a use, that use is not allowed. If you don't list a bulk standard, that bulk standard could be anything. So there's a difference there. And why I wanted to point that out is because in the state of Minnesota, there's other states that would allow this. In the state of Minnesota, you cannot have a use variance. You cannot apply for a variance to put in a use that isn't in the code. As Chair Barton stated, you need to request a text amendment to add that use. Now, when we see variances, they're all about the bulk standards. Somebody wants a taller building than the code allows, they apply for a variance. Somebody wants a shorter or smaller setback than what's allowed, they apply for a variance. But that's because the state statute looks at these two differently. A use has to be listed. If it's not listed, it's not allowed. If a bulk standard is listed, then it applies. But if a bulk standard is not listed, then the homeowner or the property owner can do whatever they want. Does that make sense? We'll get into this a lot when we get into variances, but a lot of people think they can go, oh, I want a tattoo parlor, I'll just apply for variance. I will say, we'll get into it a little bit, but it's always a difficult one. Kind of the exception is the PUD, or how each city uses a PUD. A PUD is not a variance. A PUD is a way to have different standards than what's in the code. And for that reason, you could do a PUD to allow a use that otherwise wouldn't be allowed. But it's not a variance, and that's how you kind of get around. Okay, so we're getting right into variances. This is always a very good tool. Often, if you're granting the same variance, particularly if you're granting them, you should maybe consider changing your code. You know, it may be that you're getting a lot of requests for variances, but you're denying them. Well, then your code may be adequate, because that's not proper. So we looked at not only where are all the variances, because where they're located may indicate that maybe the zoning district isn't right. Maybe it should be rezoned to something else. But also what types of variances there were and why. You'll see in most cases there's setbacks. Sometimes they were about accessory buildings, garages, and their locations or sizes. Sometimes it was lot size or lot width. So this was just a tool to use to look at where the variances were and what were they, to determine maybe the code should be changed so that everybody has the right to do that. Chair Barton, do you have anything you'd like to add about these?
I don't think so. I think at some point, potentially after we do the update for the comprehensive plan purposes, it would be maybe a good idea to look in more detail at this, particularly the more recent ones. I don't recall how far back these went, but I think they went back quite a number of years.
They went back to 1999.
Yeah. So just to get a sense, I would agree that most of them have to do with setbacks. Relief from the setback standard.
So now we're going to get into definitions. This is more complicated than I think most people would normally first think, and that's why we did the couple slides at the beginning of this presentation to try to emphasize. That being said, I would appreciate that the Planning Commission look at definition by definition and determine if that makes sense. Kind of put it either on staff, or we'll consult with the longer term planning commissioners to look at other definitions that may need to be reviewed because they're related. But I think it's comfortable to look at definition by definition and talk about whether it makes sense. I have one other example as we move through here, but there's a lot of pages. This is red line, so on this page 1, there are no proposed changes. I will just pause about the adult uses. You'll see that about halfway through, and then you'll see a lot of the information after that. That's because the state statute, even federal court cases, that kind of falls into a free speech realm. You can regulate adult uses really well, but you can't outright ban them. And so you'll see a lot of definitions. We're not proposing to change those. The attorneys worked on them real hard. We would want to consult with the attorney before we changed any of the definitions of the adult uses. We cannot remove them.
Where are they allowed, in which little category of MU to, do we even allow them in the city?
Yep. So they're right here, adult uses, conditional use in mixed use 3. So, you're an interesting size city in that you're kind of big enough where you could pick one zoning district and put them in. Bigger cities can usually find one very small zoning district to put them in. I don't know if it's the only reason, but many adult uses in Minnesota are in very small towns, because if you're your own community, you can't ban them. And so it ends up being, if you only have one zoning district or 2 zoning districts, that means it's allowed.
Up a creek.
But for our purposes, conditional use, you can regulate them, but you can't ban them, and it's only in the MU.
Hey, Eric.
Yes.
Yeah, I apologize. I'm looking at the highlighted line on that last sheet that you were just looking, and it said short-term rentals, but it didn't have anything, but it was a line. So I was just wondering if you had, or any, Elaine or anyone, have clarification on that particular line.
I believe I know this answer, but I don't know, maybe I'll turn to you, Chair Barton, if you know specifically. You're muted.
Sorry about that. I think it's highlighted because it was something we were going to address.
That's my understanding as well. I found in the files some kind of working draft regulations, but they haven't been adopted yet.
Yeah.
So I believe it's highlighted yellow, that as kind of a reminder, when we adopt short-term rental regulations, we're going to have to go back to this table and figure out which districts there are. But
right.
I don't think, I was just looking back through the file. I think it would have slowed down the adoption if we needed to adopt those regulations at the same timeline as this. It was a reminder, it's on our checklist, what we want to address. We just going to need to update this when we adopt those regulations.
Thank you. And is there a standing definition for it, or is that still also something that needs to be revisited?
I believe there's something proposed, but we'll look as we get to those regulations. But I don't know if it's, I'll need to see if it's in here, because we have a working definition, but if we're not adopting the regulations, we may leave it out and add it when we adopt the full regulations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, we would take it off of that table.
Mm-hmm.
And then at a later date. Yeah. Actually, we do have you might want to go to it. We do have a redlined item for short-term rental in the definitions.
Okay.
So maybe we could hop to that. Maybe that's a good example of, this kind of work. We can define it before we allow it. although it seems a little odd.
Okay. Oops. Is it rental short term or is it?
I have it under Shoreland.
Oh, in Shoreline.
Page
Under,
59 of 120.
oh, thank you, I don't have,
It's highlighted in red.
yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, you have to get before, there, right there.
Yep.
All right, we'll need to think about it. I mean, it's good that it's there. We want to recognize it's something we need to address.
Mhm.
When we adopt these changes, we'll have to decide whether it's going to stay in or we'll just hold it aside.
Yeah.
So there's a difference.
But for somebody who's interested in that topic too, some of the newer commissioners, that's, there's a proposed potential definition. So if you have input on that, you can certainly get that to Eric.
Exactly. So I'm going to just click through the pages that don't have any red lines, but feel free to stop me. But we'll definitely pause when we get to the ones here that are underlined. Animal grooming, that's common in that I think previously most communities assumed they would have been with the boarding facility or the veterinary, but we've all seen those businesses kind of be standalone. And then artisan studio and makerspace, that both came out of the comprehensive plan, and the downtown has spaces that are suitable for that. But it also might be a home occupation use as well.
And some of these might be actual definitions of uses that were on our use table, but we had no clear definition for them.
Yep.
So just for clarity, I think that was one of the things Olivia was putting together before she left, was making sure that we had definitions for all these uses.
Yep. So automobile sales and rental was added, and then automobile service station or repair was changed, and then instead of kind of listing all the uses, it was simplified a little bit into general repair instead of talking about installing tires, batteries, etc. So sometimes just clean up there, and then amazingly, bank or financial institution wasn't defined. I think in this case, one of the big things is the last sentence does not include payday loan business.
And so does that have a separate definition?
What doesn't it include?
It does not include payday loan businesses.
Oh, okay.
That's a good thing to note. We'll look. I haven't memorized this. We'll look to make sure, but that could be a good example why you want to do a definition is, the city may have thought bank means this, and somebody else comes in and goes, well, short-term loan is similar, but it would be good to define what is a payday loan business. Again, examples of those unintended consequences. So here we are, bulk storage liquid. And then instead of just business, getting in a little bit more into business sales and services. Car wash, catering, again, uses that are in the community but didn't have a definition. Clinic was changed, and then this last sentence is includes, so kind of describes what people may normally more call it, doctor's office, dental clinics, medical laboratories, physical occupation and massage therapy facilities, chiropractic care. So trying to define what we assume. And then coffee shop and tea house to kind of clarify that differently than a restaurant.
Eric, in that one, it doesn't say anything about drive up as being with or without drive up. It's probably worthwhile having that in there, since many of the coffee shops really require that.
That's a good comment. Contractor's business with showroom and workshop. Cultural center. Dependency living arrangement. Then you'll see the dependency living arrangement, single family dwelling units are called out quite a bit, to indicate that could be a common building that a use like that is in. So dwelling, live, work, calling out that difference that there's an expectation that some business operations would be happening in a residential unit. Simplifying the dwelling multiple family. I need to check the dwelling townhouse to see if maybe that last section isn't underlined correctly, but modifying that definition. Dwelling two family. And if you recall from the use table, both dwelling two family and dwelling townhomes, they're allowed more places in the community with this proposal than they were previously. Educational services. So you'll see this when we get to the definition of the school, but our definition of school ends at grade 12. So the educational services is meant to be kind of separate from your typical elementary, middle, high school. Farmers market. Here we have garden material sales and golf course. Grocery. I think a lot of these, we looked at the use table and made sure that we had a definition to match all the uses in the use table. Home occupation, called out that this does not include a yard sale because home occupation should get a permit from the city, and we wanted to clarify that you don't have to come to City Hall to get a permit to do a yard sale. Institutional. Got lab research, limited production and processing, and then liquor store. That's always a good one. So here you'll see lot line and lot line front. We clarified that the lot line could be a private street, not just a public street. So that was added here. medical cannabis facilities. There are changes in state statute about specific uses and when and where they're allowed. So there are times you need to update your definitions, your code to match that. Office. If you remember previously, there was a very broad definition of business, and we changed that to be business, sales, and service. So we wanted to call out the difference between a service business and an office. Parking facility, just make it parking facility, not specific to a city-owned parking facility. Personal services. So, the earlier we had business, and then it goes to business, sales, and services. So those were services aimed at other businesses, where here personal services are aimed at individuals.
Eric,
Yes.
is this an area of dry cleaning jumped out at me as being maybe different than personal services? They're providing personal services, but there's been a lot of issues about the hazardous materials used in dry cleaning. I don't know if that's taken care of now, but it might be worthwhile having it defined separately so that if we do want to, restrict where that happens or somehow manage that, maybe it's all taken care of at the state level, but I don't know that that would necessarily fit for us,
Commissioner Gleibman, I would agree with you. That's a good example of where to look at that. While a dry cleaning service most typically is aimed at individual residents, it does have other impacts that may need to be regulated. For example, it might be that it could be allowed in the same places that personal businesses are, but maybe we'd want to make that a conditional use instead of a permitted use. And having that as a standalone definition would allow us to do things that way. So I agree with you. I think it's worth pulling out.
Thank you.
Eric, I just had one other question. If we jump back up to the M's under modular building, and this may need a bigger discussion. I just want to bring it up to see if this is something that had been discussed previously, but I think this is probably a pretty common definition. And I know in the use chart, this was not currently allowed in any of the multi-use zones. Do you have any idea if, I think that this is, looking forward, this is an area that we may want to look at, because I think there's going to be more and more modular construction being done around the Twin Cities. It's starting to get big already. And I know it can be a problem between, local inspectors and state inspectors, and, who does what. And, but I think that's one area maybe we could talk a little bit more about, and think about potentially, allowing it in other spots if we, once we discuss it, if it seems like it's a possibility, because I think it is something on the horizon that is coming pretty quickly.
Commissioner Wise, I think that's a very, very good point. I know I've been seeing them. This is what I would propose doing. Now, I'm just staff, just proposing, but I'll try to explain why. There's a kind of a second step in the code. Right now, we're trying to concentrate on things to implement the comprehensive plan. So uses or lot sizes or the like to implement the code. There's a lot in the code about design standards and appearances of things that aren't really directly related, can be kind of tangentially related to the goals about appearances and type of community you have. But this is just my opinion. You could tell me, and the other architects in the audience. I think most communities were opposed to modular in the past because they normally came with a lower, lesser quality building material, and I think we're all aware that's not necessarily the case anymore. But I think that makes it a little more difficult to regulate. That makes it we need a little bit more education for all of us to make sure we understand where this market's heading and how it's moving. I agree with you wholeheartedly. If we don't address it, the development community is going to force us to address it. But I think it's not a simple addition and not something we need to do to implement a comprehensive plan. So kind of like the short-term rental and what I would propose when we get to the sign ordinance, I think we'll put it on the short list of things to look at after the code adoptions for the comprehensive plan. But I would recommend that we not slow down the adoption of the other elements here for that one issue. But I'd be more than willing to hear what you think.
Oh, I agree. That's what I was saying. It may need a bigger discussion later. Yeah, it jumped out at me as we were, looking at the chart and then seeing the definition here. So just wanted to mention it. And it can be something we can definitely talk about after the more pressing issues are done.
Well, I think, what's interesting about that is, and I think Eric made a good point, is that really is more of a design or construction standard than a use. A use is how you are going to use the property, for what purpose.
Right.
And that's where you get into, now this is really a type of building construction. Right. So I think waiting on that, and if we have it as a use, I'm not certain why.
Yeah, that's a good point too. Because it was, I believe it was under the residential use it was one of the residential uses on the chart.
Yeah, and that really, that's not a residential, the building isn't, it's a home. Right. The dwelling unit is the living space use. So that brings up an interesting little wrinkle.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, but I appreciate that comment. That's what we're looking for. We're looking for discussion items, particularly identifying things that we need to dive a little deeper in. But also very useful to kind of talk about the different ways you look at a code and uses versus structures versus bulk standard. So I think we were here at personal services and the discussion that particularly dry cleaning establishments should be called out separately. Recreation indoor commercial versus recreation outdoor commercial. And then retail sales, which would have been covered previously under the kind of generic definition of business. Again, we're trying to break out businesses a little bit, both, to see if different zoning districts may allow some of the businesses compared to others, as well as maybe certain types of businesses should be conditional compared to permitted.
I have one question on the definition of the retail sales.
Sure.
It's just one of those, I need an example. The commercial enterprise that provides goods and or services directly to the consumer where such goods are available for immediate blah, 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 and removed. Give me an example of a service that would fall under retail sales.
One that would pop to my mind would be like a meat market in like a grocery store. They may be providing a service in that they're butchering or cutting the meat in a particular way that you want. That's an example that would come up.
Which
that,
would fall under a grocery store, probably.
well, yeah, but it would be the idea of anything that the retail business would buy in bulk or wholesale, and they may customize or modify slightly for what you would take out the door compared to what came in the door.
And I guess what I was getting at is, does seem it's more tangible goods related.
It is.
Rather than, because you're not going to take the service out the door. And that's why I was just wondering about the wording of adding the and or services.
Right.
I just didn't understand. Right.
Yeah. It's quite likely that having the services may not be necessary. It may cause confusion of, can you have a service business in a retail establishment? Let me give it some thought.
Okay, okay.
We'll revisit it.
We define others, we define the service category, so I thought, I don't want to be too much confusion.
Wouldn't like an Apple store where they do, like fixing your computer or something like that, that would be a service that would be in a retail.
Sure, but so is my hair salon. Service. All I'm saying is that's a service as well. That's just where you could buy something. Yes, I agree, at an Apple store or a Best Buy or something like that. But that's just part of the retail sales aspect of it. That's all I was saying. If it were just a service, I was trying to think of just something that provided services. That's all they did. That wouldn't fit under this, correct?
Right, because this is I get your point. To the example of the Apple store, I think the Apple store would intend that you buy the Apple product, but then you're going to come back and get it updated or get something else to it. So
yeah. The reason, I mean, this is a good discussion because this gets at, if there's ever a question about what is really meant by this, if somebody argues about, well, no, this is a service, I'm allowed. This discussion helps cement why it is worded the way it is. And it kind of serves as documentation for the official record, so to speak. So that's why I brought it up. I'm not saying it has to be changed. I want to make sure.
No, but I'm really struggling with this one because I think if we remove service, it wouldn't prevent an Apple store. It wouldn't prevent grocery, the butcher store, but leaving service in, particularly with the and/or, might make somebody think they could just do services. So I get your point.
Yeah.
So I have maybe a potential example, and maybe tell me if I'm wrong because I'm super new to this. But I'm thinking of perhaps like a shop that like some sort of retail store that sells like kitchen knives or something, but also one of their main services is sharpening knives or something. So some people might come for just that service.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Councilmember Wong, I think that's exactly kind of the basis of our discussion. I think all these businesses should be something where I think your example is very good of, if you want to buy a knife, you can go to that store and buy a knife. They sell a product, but there's many products that need services through the life of that product. So I think that's where
So,
that's a
so
great.
does it have more to do with what is the primary use? I think, because think about it the other way around. A salon that is primarily a service but sells products.
Correct.
Right.
That's the opposite perspective. That would probably be a service business as opposed to a retail business, even though they're doing retail within their their daily operation. This is a case where retail is the primary, but there's a service component that you can access as well. So I
Yes,
think-
it may also provide services.
Well,
So-
to expand on what Commissioner Blees is saying, which might be a good way to do this, is instead of just having it say and or services, make it clear that the services are either accessory or ancillary
Yeah,
to the sales. So that
Yes.
clarifies you're not having just the service. You can't have a business with just the service under this explanation. But we understand that in the sale or the lifetime of the good being bought, there might be accessory services needed.
so going back to your service business definition, do you have a similar situation there where you incorporate retail as a secondary or accessory?
Yes. If you go and look at the personal
You should
services,
make them mirror each other.
right,
So right here, it's accessory retail sales.
Yeah, exactly.
it may also include that. And just adding that sentence after, the retail of goods, the sales of goods, just adding a separate sentence like
It
that.
may also include the accessory service.
Right.
Good.
I just thought maybe somebody had some example of just retail with just service, and I just couldn't think of one.
I don't think so, because that's why we have business services and personal services.
Yeah.
Okay, so here we have self-storage facilities, but this one I would like to talk about schools twofold. One, that we just have schools, elementary and secondary. Now, we had educational facilities that were earlier. So I don't know that we need a college or university or community college definition, but here we have school, elementary or secondary. And so it states it could be either public or private. And it's for one or more grades between kindergarten and grade 12. Well, Governor Dayton in particular, but even Governor Walz, one of the big things is to provide more financial resources for pre-K, and that's becoming more common with schools. So I would propose that we change this at a minimum to go pre-kindergarten or pre-K, just to clarify, because otherwise you would have to get a license for a daycare to do pre-K at a school. I didn't want to make that change here now just because what I provided was everything that was discussed previously, but I did want to call that one out. That's a change I would like to make. The school structure, state initiatives, are including more pre-K into your traditional schools. So self-storage facilities,
Anybody have any input on that proposal? It seems reasonable for the definition of schools.
I would agree. Yeah, I just got a question for a question that was on top of yours, Chair Barton. Does that also include like early childhood family education? Would that be lumped into that as well, or is that its own category?
I guess I'd like to expand on that a little bit. So if it was meant to be like a class that occurs within a school but kind of happens outside of normal school hours, either it could be accessory and doesn't need its own definition, or I think a definition like that would be fine, but we'd want to make sure that could occur within a school, but that I'd like to clarify that use may occur somewhere else other than a school, correct?
I guess the only things I can think of are in the school.
Okay.
But that's a good question. I mean,
so
And I believe there are some schools that are some districts that have, the early education in a facility of its own.
Mm-hmm.
So
Well, let me
it's pretty
think-
wide range.
Oh no, you're right. You're right. I guess that does remind me. Some school districts have that as well as continuing education.
Mhm.
Let me think about that, because it may need its own definition, but that might fall into the supplemental regulations that we would have for a school compared to calling it out as a separate principal or conditional use. I think it's good that we clarify that is something that's associated with a school district, a school. Those are services that should be provided. But if I could, let me noodle on that a little bit about how exactly to address that on the ordinance to determine whether it makes sense to have its own standalone definition, or there's another way for us to deal with that regulation.
Mhm.
But
Sounds
let me-
handy.
Good.
I think your pre-K suggestion makes a lot of sense to me. I would be all for that change in the definition here.
If I may, so if we're thinking about early childhood and family education, oftentimes that falls within community education programs, and also built for families and children under 5. So would that also include pre-K?
Yeah, I think there's a gray area on where some of these start and stop. This is just my own personal definition. I don't know that everybody else would define it that way, but some of those early childhood classes are meant to be kind of the whole family, or the parent and the children, and occur kind of outside that normal class hours, where I'm more familiar of the pre-K kind of happening at the same time as the school during the business hours. Might be just parsing that apart too much, but that's the exact thing I want to noodle on a little bit to see, is it its own standalone use? Is it a use that is expected at a school that we want to make sure it is defined as an accessory or ancillary use, that kind of thing. But I think that's a very good point, Councilmember Wong. Any other comments about schools? We will definitely revisit this, so we don't need to decide the exact language on schools today, but I just wanted to point that out so that way I appreciate this feedback, and we'll spend a little bit more time on this in March. So short-term rental, we discussed that one already. We have every intention of regulating the short-term rentals. We may temporarily remove this until we kind of button up what the full regulations of that would be. As well, I'd almost propose removing it because how we end up regulating may affect how we define it. And then you'll see here, we're starting on signs. My proposal would be to leave this as is because we have an existing sign code, but when we dive more into the sign ordinance, we'll definitely have to revisit these definitions. So I'll page through these pretty quick. So no changes on this site, but you'll see quite a bit about solar, just because that's becoming more common. Sport courts, add that definition. Transit station, that has been added. And again, clarifying that a transit station is not simply a transit stop. It's a structure unto itself. Oops. Warehousing, make sure, again, expanding on the different types of businesses, particularly in light of businesses that have different impacts or would require different zoning districts. I don't know if Chair Barton or anyone else could maybe indicate what the thought was of striking the on the same lot with the principal building. Was that just because it's redundant?
Well, I'm looking at this now, just reading through it. I don't believe we use that in any of the other yard definitions. And so it was, why did we include it there?
Yeah.
Kind of thing. But I will point out that, again, the definition of the front yard, if you compare that, if the front yard definition were written the way the rear yard is, referencing the principal building, that's exactly what we need, instead of referencing the setback amount. And again, that front yard definition is one that created a code enforcement issue for the city because it, somebody questioned it, and even though it seems pretty apparent that what the front yard should be, the wording doesn't reflect that.
Mm-hmm. I could see that also being an issue with nonconformities, where going to the building would make a lot more sense.
Yeah. Well, and that is how it's always been measured, and I'm not even sure when I don't recall it changing to this particular language. It really was worded the way the rear yard is.
I think that's better. So
certainly clearer to somebody reading it.
Yep.
Some poor resident trying to figure out, what does that mean?
Yep. And then finally, yard sale. Again, we clarified in home occupation that a yard sale was not a home occupation, so we added yard sale as its own definition. Okay, so that's the definitions. I appreciate that we went in that time, and I certainly appreciate the conversation. That's, as you've seen, the longest portion of this amendment, as well as the longest portion of the ordinance. But I hope this discussion and the previous example really emphasized the importance of getting the definitions. Okay, so just talking about options for residences. And again, as the use chart showed, probably a little bit of allowing them in more locations than previous. So ADUs, that's the abbreviation of an accessory dwelling unit. That's one of the big distinctions between that and a two-family. A two-family is meant to be, or could be equal in size, two separate uses with a common wall. An ADU is one is accessory to the other. So that also could fall into ownership types of things, that it may be an expectation that a two-family dwelling, one family owns one dwelling, another family owns the other dwelling. An ADU should be in one ownership. We understand that there's two different households, but an ADU is under one ownership. So just that distinction. And then cottage, just a different type of house. So talking a little bit more about ADUs and then kind of its distinction from a two-family dwelling. A little bit of changes from single family to principal, acknowledging that there are these other types of family arrangements. Home occupations, stating how that may apply to a ADU. And then cottages, you'll see the 1,000 from 975, trying to get into the detail of kind of what defines a cottage.
Can I just mention one thing, Eric, and that just for the new commissioners and the new council liaison, is one of the reasons these additions are being made is one of the goals of the comprehensive plan is alternative housing, different styles, more variety, to meet, different demands of various family sizes and makeups. So that's where we got into the accessory dwelling units and what's called a cottage development, which really is more of a little, smaller dwelling units grouped together. They don't have to be as big as a townhome or a typical two-family dwelling. So that's the reason you see several of those items. So as you're reading through it, be sure to, think through if there's anything you think should be changed about them or added, but keeping that in the back of your mind that it's really to meet the demands of a real diverse population of people who need housing.
I agree with what you're saying. This is just a minor typo on this page under A1. I think the B about halfway through the first line should be crossed out or taken out. In cottage develop.
Or at least changed in order with not, but yeah, I'll take a look at it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks.
And Commissioner Geldman, thank you for that. Those are the kinds of things when people review those. If you find any more of those, email me those as well. I certainly do appreciate comments like that.
Could, Rick, maybe you probably will be able to explain this, but would you tell me, in the middle of the page here, the cottage development, 25% of the site within a minimum of one contiguous area at least 3,000 square feet in size is required for the usable open space.
Uh,
Can you tell me how?
is that go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
No, I'm just trying to orient to where you're talking about. Is that under 1A or
Yes.
1B,
B1E.
1E? Okay.
Yes, yeah. It's on the back side of the page you just made the correction on.
Right. Contiguous.
I'm trying to picture, is that because this was like almost like a cul-de-sac kind of thing, a little village type development?
Yeah, I think my thought on it is that what we're trying to do is create a tiny neighborhood.
Right,
So
right.
that there's a common space amongst everybody, and that just defines what the minimum square footage is for that common area or the shared area. So everybody can kind of look in on the little pond or the open space with the nice tree or whatever it is,
Yeah. It was when I looked at the one contiguous area and I thought, okay, now I confused myself. But I was thinking
Yeah.
what it was. Thanks, Rick.
So this is probably a good conversation because me, kind of an outsider looking in, I'll tell you what I read when I see this, and you can tell me if this is what you intended it to be. Since 25% of the site is first, to add up to the total to 25%, that could be more than one area of open space. But if there is any open space, one of those areas need to be at least 3,000 square feet in size. So there could be a secondary open space that is less than that.
I think that's,
That's-
yeah, there could be just a bunch of little scattered 500 square foot open spaces. Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Commissioner Geldman, is
Geldman.
that how you would?
Yes, that's correct. I'd agree with that. Mhm.
Great, thank you. So special infill housing. Then we get into the townhouse to clarify 2 families separate from the townhouse. And then again, this is many structures and some uses require supplementary regulations. So this is outside of the zoning districts themselves, but still important things to consider. Clarifying here in the residential districts, the maximum living space per unit. Again, getting more varieties of housing types, and so we want to make sure that it's per unit, not per structure.
Did we actually say or have a consensus on allowing townhomes in the MU1? I just am trying to verify that. Which is essentially the downtown.
Mhm.
Anybody recall? I mean,
You're asking me to dig into the back deep files of my brain, Elaine. It's really difficult to do. I don't remember.
I know. I don't remember having the conversation. But then again, I could look back at the chart to see if they're allowed now. If they're allowed now, then it's a non-issue. If they're not, then that would be a change. So I'll do that while you continue on.
Okay. Again, just making sure that we're adding all these different types of residential structures.
It is a P now, and it is a change in the proposed update. So it wasn't allowed before. Now it is proposed as a permitted use in downtown.
Chair Barton, are you reconsidering that or just
I'm
pointing?
picturing it, I'm just picturing it in my mind, and I'm not. I have to think about that and go back perhaps and look at the zoning map and the purpose of downtown. The purpose of downtown is, primarily a business.
And maybe more density than what a townhouse project would bring, maybe.
Well, more the land usage for townhomes. If we tried to get as many residents as we will have in the new apartment, the new apartments on the corner of 7th and Margaret, if we tried to do that in townhomes, it would be a huge development.
Well, this is an
Think about it.
outsider kind of looking in, but from the way your blocks are laid out in the downtown, that pretty much there's alleys available there.
Yeah,
It's a very attractive layout for townhomes that you could
yeah, it could be behind.
to access off the alley.
Yeah. And that
But-
might be why we did it. It's just one of those discussions that I don't recall clearly.
But I think this is a very good point, because I think if you looked at it kind of like in the infrastructure that is there, I think townhouses would make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But if you have a goal of downtown, of vibrancy, of small retail, of a larger density of population to support those businesses, then maybe townhouses isn't the best use.
Yeah.
So it's a good discussion to have.
Yeah.
I'll certainly note to revisit that in.
Okay.
Now, that is one of those things that, since you have the downtown overlay, and I'm not quite sure why the downtown overlay doesn't kind of go over all of downtown, that might be a way to use that overlay district to say where the overlay district is, townhomes would
Right.
not be allowed, but where the MU1 zoning district is, but not downtown overlay, it could be allowed.
Yes, exactly. The downtown is larger, it extends further, and the overlay covers the main area, shopping type area. So in the outlying downtown, that it probably would not be an issue.
Right. Okay, so let me look at that when we come back in March and see if maybe the overlay district is a way.
I just noticed your modular housing on that prior page there. Andrew, it was referenced.
I did see that. I was going to come back and check that out after we were done.
Architectural.
But Commissioner Wise, to your point, isn't it also that modular construction is not only housing anymore? They're becoming modular commercial developments. Even I've seen a couple modular industrial developments. Just one of the reasons why we should visit that more in depth.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And, mixed use where you can mix housing with, retail on ground level, something like that for sure. Yeah.
So that was the section about expanding the types of housing units that would be allowed in the community. I kind of introduced it a little bit. Planned unit developments are unique, and I got to say I need to look at this a little bit more in detail to wrap my head around it, because in Minnesota it's very unique that they give you two choices of how to do planned unit developments. One is it's just like a conditional use permit. It's you have an underlying zoning district and then you have a PUD over it. Or you could do it as its own zoning district, but then doing that can get a little burdensome because you have to look at it like a zoning district. Describe all the uses, describe all the bulk standards. If it's not mentioned, they can't do it, all that kind of thing. But it's a very nice, useful tool. It also should include purpose statements that get at the benefit to the public. So it's just not a way for, not sure why, Peter seems to be a little slow on this, but in my opinion, PUD should not just be an option to avoid a variance. It should be that this is something unique, that either the property is unique or the use is unique, that requires a more flexible way to do zoning. But in my opinion, it shouldn't be to just avoid variances. But that did get back to my previous comment of, in Minnesota, you cannot do use variances. So a PUD is a way to address a use that isn't otherwise listed. And so that's why this red line portion was added, that it not only is a coordinated development, but it provides public benefit in exchange for that flexibility. So the community at large, not just the owners or occupants of the PUD, should gain some benefit from that flexibility. So purpose statements are very important in PUD because that's how you evaluate what the community is looking for when we're talking about public benefit.
I will mention on this page, is it on this page? There it is, way down at the bottom. The one before the blue, the permitted uses. This does get at that the uses allowed in the underlying district are allowed.
And you have that ability. You have the ability to be more restrictive than the state. That if you want to make it clear that you don't want to grant or use this as a way to do use variances, but this is the code being more restrictive than the state standard, which I want to clarify is absolutely appropriate, but I just want to call it, that's your choice. You're not being required to do that.
Well, since you mentioned it, I thought I would just mention that we have, made a choice here as far as, no, we're not going to just allow whatever. We made a lot of changes in this one, a lot of rewording.
Well, it's not overly surprising because, as you stated earlier, when you are amending the ordinance, you have a lot of discretion. Once the ordinance is adopted, there's a lot less discretion. So it's common for communities, kind of like we looked at variances, to look at PUDs that have happened and did you really get what you thought you should? And the right path is amend your ordinance to ensure that the community gets what it needs.
One thing we wanted to make sure, and I think, Rick, you were the one who brought it up in this PUD section, and so probably a little easier to find when we get a clean copy, is to ensure that this cannot be used for a single family residence, where that's all that's on the property is one single family residence.
Yeah, definitely. I think, we had some experiences there that,
Right.
Going this way really, clarified the situation and what we were after and what the purpose of the PUD is.
So just as you're reading through it, before our next meeting, folks, just see if as you read this, that is what you're left with, that this is not meant for somebody to use to just do something with their single family home. That doesn't change, really, it doesn't change the use of the home or add any, new use or anything like that.
Yes.
Concept PUD, expanding on that, requiring a neighborhood meeting, both very good additions for, basically amending what would otherwise be required if not for the PUD, avoiding that variance, really does warrant that extra public engagement.
Mhm.
And that's something I think that came out of a lot of the public hearings that we've had
Right.
in the past for properties, where it draws a lot of people in because they're concerned, and sometimes it ends up being that the developer at that stage in the development is more than able to accommodate what it is the concerns are for the neighborhood. And that neighborhood meeting can just be so important for allowing that to happen. So I think that's why we wanted that in here.
Yeah, I think, is it perception or is it reality? But to a lot of people's eyes, a PUD is a way for one property owner or one developer to get something that others do not have. I could find many reasons to argue that's not necessarily what a PUD is doing, but for that perception alone, if no other reason, having that extra public engagement and involvement is a very good idea.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm assuming this reference to the sketch plans was probably removed due to the concept plan language, so kind of replacing that.
One question I had on this, just because it's really kind of confusing, and there's multiple steps to this. There's the concept plan, potentially there's the preliminary PUD, then there's the final PUD. So there's multiple steps. And you're familiar with other cities' ordinances, but is there a way to maybe deal with those, piece by piece? In other words, instead of flipping back between, as I was reading through it, I was trying to think, okay, now I'm looking at the preliminary plan standards again, and I read about the preliminary plan 3 pages ago. In other words, to try to keep the steps together, the pieces of the steps, if you understand what I'm saying.
I do.
And I don't know, maybe there's not a way to do it, but this one just does seem a little hard to follow.
And I think that's a very valid point. I've seen other ordinances that don't do that for the fact of I wouldn't want to do it if what happens is things like review process ends up 3 times instead of having a review process and saying that applies to all 3. But
I gotcha.
That's might be the exception rather than the rule. But I'll take a look at it and see if it makes more sense to organize it differently.
Yeah, I had nothing to offer as far as here's a template.
Just one clarification here where we're talking about the changes that are allowed. It says change in the design of 10% or less of any building elevation. Is that that's in terms of like amount of glazing or like square footage or?
Well, it could get even down to it was brick, and now when they're redoing the siding, they're proposing it to be, metal panel or something. But yeah, could be glazing, could be anything like that. And that does come up a lot when those types of building permits are being requested. You know, you want people to invest in their buildings and you're replacing siding. But a lot of people argue that you know, replacing the siding isn't changing the square footage by 10%. So I should be able to change 90% of my exterior building materials. So it's clarification to kind of help with that. I mean, you want to put in a new window, you shouldn't have to amend your PUD. But if you want to go from 90% brick to 90% metal panels, you might have to come in and amend.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
So that was the PUD. As Chair Barr said, that's definitely a section to spend a little time with, but also understand, you know, it's complicated, but at the same time, it could, if used incorrectly, be used to provide, kind of pick winners and losers, allow one developer something that other developers wouldn't get. And that's not really the intention. It could be that one developer has a piece of property that is attractive for public use and you can negotiate that, where another property owner doesn't. There's nothing attractive about that site. So it's very important to have this flexibility, but not turn it into, you know, kind of solely about a financial return is the only reason why you grant. And again, we don't want to just use the PUD to avoid variances. If a variance is needed, they should apply for a variance. So parking ordinance, these also always need to be updated. This actually also includes vehicles, talking about oversized vehicles. You know, the types of vehicles always change. So making some of those clarifications, defining them better.
Before you go on there, Eric, we in the middle of page 104, vehicle, comma, passenger, in that category, at the last part of it says passenger vehicles does not include motorcycles, motor scooters, buses, blah, blah. But it doesn't really define what motorcycles, motor scooters, and so on are. And I don't know, it just seems like there's something missing there when that's missing.
Good point.
You know, it might be possible just to reference the state language for those other vehicles rather than add them to our definitions. Just a thought.
Mm-hmm.
You like to do that. Also helps when the state changes their rules, we don't have to change our code.
Right.
Yep. But I do think it's good to point out when you call out what it doesn't apply to, you should probably, you know, figure out how to define those. Then clarifying the difference between standards for non-residential compared to residential areas. Adding requirements or clarifying requirements about screening of these vehicles. Paved surface.
There's kind of a goofy little thing in there. The way it's worded, the screening vegetation has to be 6 feet exact. And that should be minimum of 6 feet rather than exactly, because trees have a tendency to grow.
Good.
at the bottom of that page,
Mm-hmm.
item D, the setbacks.
Yep.
The second, the corrected or the additional language, that's the parking setback. That's not the parking areas, technically a new driveway or whatever. And there was some place that was replacing other language. I mean, in other words, this is where you can park your vehicle.
Yep.
And that needs to be clear, because otherwise it seems like my parking spot, where I put it has to be this or that, but it's really your vehicle.
Okay.
And I trying to spot where that was. I think it was later on somewhere or earlier in the old version. I'll look and see where it was and maybe get back to you. I
Right.
just kind of spot it there.
I appreciate that.
Did we ever figure out what to do about those lots where parking one vehicle in the driveway, they're not complying with the setback?
I thought I saw that referenced on the last page of this. It said waivers discussed with city attorney.
Yeah.
And that was about, we do have some properties where their driveways or their front yards, let's put it that way, are not even 25 feet deep,
Mm-hmm.
which means for them to park without encroaching, let's put it that way, into that 10-foot from the street, from the curb would be difficult. And some aren't even 25 feet from the road. They've got like 10 or 15 feet of driveway. So what we were proposing is maybe some way that there could be a waiver that would not require them to try to do a variance of some kind. And it would just be for that limited purpose, because we don't have a lot of them, but we do have them. So that was what that was referencing.
Okay. We're gonna have Soren here on the 25th, and I need to touch base with him before that, so I'll
Okay.
make sure we add that.
Yeah.
Questions? Okay, any last things about parking?
Oh, yeah, on the 7204, now that's in another section of code, just for the new folks. That's in the traffic section of code, so this won't be in the zoning code, that last area there. But I did notice, it references chapter 154
Mm-hmm.
for commercial vehicles, blah, blah, blah. I don't know if we want to put more than that, because it says commercial vehicles as defined in 154. And I think we're defining it in a particular section of 154. So if they went to the definition section, it wouldn't be there.
Mm,
In 154.01, whatever this is. 010. So it might be good to just reference this section of zoning. And that's mentioned twice. It's in the A and B. Again, just make it easy for people. If for the people who haven't had to go through this word by word like you folks now.
okay.
And while this is off topic, but well, not off topic, but I noticed when I was looking for table 8 and 7, and I went to our online PDF version of the zoning code on the city website, and it did not have it doesn't have all the tables.
I noticed that. as well.
Just FYI. Oh, okay.
We'll fix that, because I think I don't think there's anything after 7. the tables for the sign code aren't in there either. So.
Yeah. Okay,
Okay, so the last section we're going to review is sign ordinance. I think before we do, I'll expand it a little bit on my opinion on not only sign ordinances, but this sign ordinance, and also expand on the conversation I had with Chair Barton this afternoon. It's very important to update this sign ordinance. I can't emphasize that enough, but it's going to take some work, and it doesn't implement really the comprehensive plan. So I did not slow down changing or amending the code to implement the comprehensive plan. I would propose to do this separately. One of the big, two big things, as you know, for the people who were at the Planning Commission meeting last week, Chair Barton stated it's not laid out very well. You know, it could be laid out a lot better, how things are referenced. But even beyond that, I don't believe this sign ordinance complies with both the federal and state regulations, and in particular, the Supreme Court cases recently. And to just try to shortly describe it, previous to this Supreme Court case in 2015, you basically reviewed your sign code and you made sure that whatever regulation you had on commercial speech was treated equally. You could be more accommodating for non-commercial speech, but you can't have commercial speech regulated differently, basically picking winners and losers, picking different types of commercial speech. This last court case, it was related to the previous one, but it went even farther, and it said we shouldn't even be talking about that at all. A sign is a sign. First Amendment rights for what the sign says, you know, with obvious exceptions of profanity and the like. We should be regulating where the sign's located, what zoning district it's in, how tall it is it lit, those kinds of things. We should not be either picking one use can have more signage than another use, and we should not be describing what is the content. Two examples would be current code allows institutional uses more signage in a residential zone than a residential use. We have things like directional signage. That is still content. So we pick how many signs, how big the signs, the business or even the resident picks what it says and what it's used for. That's not what this code is. So we have some red lines and we have some comments in here which I think are relevant about things we need to be addressed. But this really feels like a complete removal and start over, not going through and redlining this. I want to check in with the city attorney to make sure that's the strategy. He thinks he agrees that this code is, you know, potentially a lawsuit waiting to happen. So I think it's worth going through some of the comments to highlight some issues we want to revisit, but I'd really not recommend that we go through and try to redline this because I think it's a complete gut and start over. Chair Barton, do you want to add anything to that before we?
I think you put it quite well. And I think that's partially why this is so hard to get through, is because it is trying to be so specific. And you can have, you know, this real estate sign and you can have this construction sign, but you can't have that sign and you have to have this other one. And there's just too much in there, too many types of signs, which aren't really types of signs. They have nothing to do with the type of sign it is, like a freestanding sign or a wall sign or a window sign. So, and I do agree, I think it would probably be better to just toss it out and start over. I'm sure there's some cities that have had to, well, I know there are cities that have had to do that because they've been sued and their sign code has been declared unconstitutional.
Right.
Well, they have no code that they can apply. It's happened in Minnesota not that long ago. So I agree, it needs a lot of work. And that will also change those definitions that we have in the definition section, which is why I think Eric said to, we'll just leave those be for now, because we're going to have to dig into which ones do we get rid of and which ones do we reword. So I would agree. I think we should just not, we want to deal with this as quickly as we can, but not as part of the zoning update for the comprehensive plan purposes.
No.
So.
Yeah, that sounds like a good way to approach it to me.
A good recommendation, Eric.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I would want any comments that would be, particularly that deal with location or size or zoning districts. I'd even be okay with kind of like the overall intent or goal of the ordinance, but I don't want to spend a lot of time on specifics of whether the political sign should be in an exception. What do we do for the cities and the city's ability, and particularly, that institutional gets more signage than residential.
Well, and I think the place you have to be careful is in your exceptions.
Yep.
And what you prohibit, but particularly in exceptions. If you've got too many exceptions, then you have a problem, because what's the purpose of having these standards if you're going to, just exempt all these types of entities in many cases?
Correct.
There was also a table associated with this that just had so many different conditions that there were too many variables for it to be reasonable to understand. And
Correct.
I think we need to simplify that thing as well.
Yeah.
I mean, I get it. I get why people want to regulate these things. People may even argue what's the public benefit of doing that. But if the courts are saying you don't have the authority to do it, let's get rid of it instead of trying to argue about how we can try to skirt the edges of it.
Yeah. You just set reasonable limits, and they just need to be reasonable. One thing I was going to mention that does need to be incorporated is the electronic
Yes.
digital messaging signs. We've never had standards for those.
Right.
And we just need to get some. There don't need to be a lot of them, I don't think, but we need to get that in there.
Yeah, because that's a great example, because kind of the difference between the content and the sign,
Mm-hmm.
you can regulate if it flashes. You could regulate how fast it changes, how often it changes.
Right.
You can't regulate what it says before it changes or after it changes, but you have the authority to say it's going to be distracting to drivers if it's changing every second or it's flashing every second. You just can't say what it says. You can regulate how that changes, and that's the thing with digital signs. I think it almost is the ship has sailed that's part of our environment now. So it's better to regulate it than try to adopt the philosophy that because it's not mentioned, you can't do it.
Right. We haven't adopted that philosophy. That's part of the problem.
Yeah.
We've allowed them, but we have no regulations for them.
Exactly. Okay, so this is the end of our sections. Again, the intent was to review it and kind of be educational of the purpose of what we're doing. And then, as I always like to do, we're kind of putting a fence around it. I enjoy to have a conversation about any of these topics, but figure out, what's the purpose of this? This is to implement the comprehensive plan, make sure we're doing that, but let's put a fence around that, adopt this. There are many reasons why there's other sections of the zoning ordinance that need to be updated, but let's tackle those separately. So I think I got good feedback with that, but one last opportunity for any comments before we move on to kind of talk about the schedule of future meetings.
Well, I think we have a consensus on the approach that you're saying. I haven't heard anybody object to that. So, yeah, it's a go.
I just want to thank you, Eric. Oh, I'm sorry, Alan, go ahead.
The other thing I'd like to add is, are other communities, do they have an ordinance on signs ready that we can just copy?
Some newer ones, we definitely look at communities that have had sign ordinances that have been adopted in the last 3 to 5 years that start with that. Many of them have, because of not trying to address content or pick winners of users of certain types of businesses that have it. I would propose that we start with a pretty good recent one. Did that address your comment?
Yeah, thank you.
And the shorter, the better. I've seen a couple that are quite short compared to what we have.
Agreed. Commissioner Wise, I think I had seen you turn your mic on.
I just wanted to thank you, Eric. That was really helpful for those of us that are seeing some of this stuff and, weren't involved in the initial discussions to get a really good sense of where we are now and where we came from. And it's a lot of heavy stuff, but that was a really helpful explanation. Thank you.
Yeah, we wanted to, try to explain how we use it, which, hopefully is helpful when you read it to understand, what to come to. So thank you for that.
I would echo that. I appreciate the walkthrough. I think you did a bang up job kind of explaining some of the context to this. And from the commission members that have worked on this for some time, I really appreciate some of that backstory. So thank you all.
I third that, and I think the city council appreciates, not having a potential lawsuit again or also thank you.
No doubt.
I say you guys are coming in at a good time to get a sense of this is what former council member Sonic called the sausage making.
Mhm.
This is what we're doing right now, and it's tedious and it's time consuming, but it is so important to just give it the effort.
Well, if I can maybe make one last suggestion, I agree with you, Chair Barton. This is very timely. I mean, this is a good way to kind of walk through what the role of the Planning Commission is, why this is important, and not have an actual application in front of you where we have to act on that tonight. Mm-hmm. Particularly for the newer planning commissioners, maybe what I'd ask is take this meeting and kind of what we talked about, and instead of concentrating on wordsmithing the ordinance, concentrate on the concepts. But to do that, I would be interested in you newer members now taking a look at the comprehensive plan. Think about what the comprehensive plan says about the goals and the policies and what the intent of the, what kind of community we want. And then take another look at this and see, are we really moving in the direction? Because it isn't all just about, okay, we've changed our density about medium density residential. So now we're changing our R2 density. I think Chair Barton did a good job of describing it, of identifying that you need more types of residential. There's not every family lives the same. Not everybody has the same income. Empty nesters, there could be 1,000 reasons. I'd be interested if you take a look at the comprehensive plan now, in light of this review, do you really think that we're implementing the comprehensive plan due to these changes? Okay, we're not required to take any action here. Just to reiterate, please provide me any comments that you have in the next couple of weeks. My intention, actually, what we talked about, Chair Barton and I, is my next copy that I'm going to give you is actually going to be a clean copy. It's not going to be a red line copy, or at least I'm going to give you a clean copy. What I will do in that new kind of clean copy, I'll redline changes that we made from today's draft to address the comments. So the copy you'll see will be mostly clean, and anything that is redlined in that next copy will be things that we changed since what we reviewed tonight. So keep what you have here tonight, because that will be, what's changed since the beginning. Next month, we'll really concentrate on those tweaks to improve it from what we talked about tonight. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to go back to the beginning of the agenda, just because we've completed a different section of the agenda, and I guess I'll be polite, turn it back over to you, Chair Barton.
Right, and I get to throw it right back at you because it's reports from staff. So Eric, gosh, we haven't heard from you for 10 seconds.
Got to keep these orders right, these roles correct, because again, I report to you, you don't report to me. I know sometimes I can feel the opposite. But my report, well, I got kind of two reports from staff. Before we go to the calendar, we have not received any applications for this month. So the next Planning Commission meeting should be just the review of the ordinance. There won't be any applications. We have heard that there will be two conditional use permit amendments for two schools. We've heard that North St. Paul High School is doing an addition, and then Cowern Elementary School is doing a small addition as well. So we expect those to be submitted in the beginning of March, but then it wouldn't be till the April Planning Commission that you'll see those. And then finally, just to highlight the calendar, it kind of blends into that. The calendar that I provided, this essentially is a calendar of regular Planning Commission meetings. That somebody's turning in an application, this is the process, even highlights a little bit the process for you of, we take some time to review it, deem it complete. We send a notice to the paper and the neighbors, public hearing notice, and then what Planning Commission meeting it is. And then we have like that number 3, but typically it's a month before it goes to the City Council. The reason why is, should the Planning Commission make recommendations for changes to a set of plans, that gives the applicant time, if they want to implement those changes, to revise their plans, submit them, and we can put them in the City Council packet. Many applicants are willing to do that, and I think it certainly shows when they go to the City Council meeting that they've listened to the comments either at the public hearing or from the Planning Commission and showed ways to address it. So if it happens to be a case that it's approved or recommended approval without any changes, there is actually a City Council meeting 12 days after the Planning Commission meeting normally. So should it be a pretty simple application that could be addressed quickly, it's possibly to be done quicker, but I just wanted to express that because the intention isn't to slow down the process. A lot of times it's actually a positive feature to be able to have people, address those changes and show that at the City Council meeting. And so then I think, I know I'm turning it back over to you, Chair Barton, but I think then it's for the rest of the commission.
Okay. Thanks. You can take the agenda off of your stop sharing screen if you want. That way I'll be able to see everybody. Just to make sure that they're not napping. All righty, then it's just time for reports from commissioners. So I'll just run through everybody. Andrew, anything to share?
I do not have anything to share this week. No.
Okay, Rick?
Well, the Silver Lake Improvement Association annual meeting for members and for interested parties is happening on the 15th of the month. I think it's a Monday. Just a minute, let me double check the date.
That is a Monday.
Okay, good. Yeah, that's when it is then. And it'll be a Zoom meeting. So if people are interested, they can go to the website. It's silverlakeNSP.org, and check out what's been happening over the past year with the association.
Okay, thanks. Al?
I have nothing to report.
Okay,
Other than Eric to keep it simple.
and me? Oh,
Tell Eric to keep it simple.
right. Eric?
I have nothing to add.
Okay,
Okay, yeah, one of two Erics, right?
I know. Patrick?
I just have a question. Does anyone know, there was a tentative meeting set the 25th for training?
Mhm.
Anybody know if that's going to really happen?
My understanding is it is. It's on the bottom, still on the bottom of the agenda page. It's a special meeting.
Yeah. Okay. I was wondering, it's on my calendar, but it was sort of, Scott had said he was going to check with
Right.
others. So
Yeah, it now says there will be a special planning commission meeting, so I'm assuming, unless Eric, you know differently?
That is correct. We did need to loop back with the city attorney to make sure that that has been done, so that one's correct. The one we haven't announced yet is the one at the end of March, which is intended to be the joint EDA planning commission meeting, because we need to wait for the EDA meeting to clarify that. But good point to catch, and I just want to take the opportunity to say the EDA meeting has not been finalized yet.
Okay.
Okay, I've got a standing conflict on the 2nd and the 4th Thursday evenings. But if it were on the 3rd Thursday of the month, I could make that. So if that's possible, that would be, that'd allow me to be able to attend.
Chair Gleebman, so if you don't mind, the intention of this next meeting is training, really aimed at more, newer members. I don't think you are as much needed that. I will convey your message to Scott about the EDA meeting, because I do think that would be very beneficial that you make it to that one. So if you're okay,
Thank you.
That will the training meeting.
Yeah, that fits for me. That was what I was mainly concerned about, is the economic development one. Thank you.
All righty. And I apologize, Councilperson Warren. Usually, I start with a councilperson liaison when I do the reports from commissioners, but your name wasn't listed there, and the agendas used to have that, which was my guide. So I'll now ask if you have anything you want to share from the council.
I don't believe that I do. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks for mixing it up, though, Elaine.
Yeah, exactly. The only thing I'll mention, and it has to do actually with the agenda, but just a reminder that if you're unable to make a regular planning commission meeting or even the special meetings, be sure to get back to staff and let them know. This becomes particularly important in those meetings where we actually have action items and we need a quorum. So we always like to know ahead of time that we're going to have people there. And there used to be, and maybe Eric, you could just kind of ensure it gets added at the bottom of our agenda when it comes out. It just used to be a reminder that Olivia would send if you're unable to attend, to please, contact her. And maybe you could give your email address, because you've mentioned a couple times that folks can contact you if they have some comments they want to make about what we've gone over.
Right.
I was just going to ask that.
Okay, I'll give you my email address. To your first comment, Chair Barton, probably would have been better that I put my email address on it. But the reason we didn't do that, but do intend to do it moving forward, is Liz, I believe is her name. Liz is starting on Monday, so she'll be the new planning secretary, and then she'll be available for a comment.
I
So,
think that was the reason. I just wanted to kind of pass it along just in case.
So my email address is, and I'll spell it out here in a minute, but it's my first initial, last name, no dot between it, and then at my company's initials, WSB, and then since we were originally an engineering company, ENG, so it's WSBENG.com. So my full email address is E as in Eric, Z as in zebra, W-E, B as in boy, E-R, at WSBENG.com.
Okay.
So,
Yeah.
Erica, I have a question for you relative to your work history.
Yes,
Did you work at AST?
I did not.
There's a different Eric Weber spelled exactly the same way.
There's 7 of us in the Twin City metro area. Surprisingly, a lot of people don't meet a lot of Zwabers, but
Yeah.
there are a lot of them, and a lot of them are named Eric. So
Okay, that's interesting.
if you want to meet the manager of the Culvers at West St. Paul,
Okay, good to know.
All righty, then I don't think we have anything else. I'll just point out, just for kicks, that, we moved our meeting 15 minutes. We would have been done 15 minutes ago.
Oh, yeah.
I like that. That was very good.
A little closer to 9 o'clock. Anyway, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Al, did you want to make a motion?
I'll second it.
Okay, I'll make the motion.
That was Rick. Okay.
Rick.
Al seconds, out of order. All those in favor will say aye when the roll is called. Those opposed will say no.
Chair Barton,
Aye.
Commissioner Blees,
Aye.
Commissioner Brenna,
Aye.
Commissioner Gelbman, and I
Aye.
apologize for not getting your name correct today. Commissioner Wise
Aye.
and Commissioner Worm.
Aye.
All right, we're adjourned at 9:21. Have a good evening, everyone. See you on the 4th, March 4th.